Why, hello, fellow historians. I'm Tammy the Time Traveller. I know what you're thinking to yourself. She looks an awful lot like Miss Iorio. Well, you can tell us apart by the fact that I'm wearing a blazer. It's come to my understanding that normally we would have met in an escape game that your teacher does. In that escape game, you help rescue me from my timey-wimey prison. Now you get to meet me under different circumstances. We're going to go on an adventure, and I'm going to take you along with me as we visit key moments in the history of French-English relations in Canada. So hold on to your hats. I can't wear a hat, my head is too big. Let's go! Where are we? Oh wait, I see, this is the October Crisis. As you might recall, at the request of Quebec Premier Robert Bourassa and Montreal Mayor Jean Drapeau, Trudeau took decisive action, the Vendus were dispatched, and the War Measures Act was invoked. What did you think about Trudeau's decision to declare the War Measures Act? Did you think it was overreach, or did you think it was justified in light of the circumstances? In any case, the October Crisis drew attention to the separatist movement. While polls taken at the time suggested that most people approved of the declaration of the War Measures Act, it likely contributed to a rise in popularity of René Lévesque and Quebec nationalism in general. For example, in response to this rise in Quebec nationalism, the government of Robert Bourassa created Bill 22, otherwise known as Quebec's Official Languages Act. This made French the language of commerce and government. I should probably mention to you that René Lévesque broke with the Quebec Liberal Party in 1967. He eventually founded Parti Québécois in 1968. There he pushed for what was known as sovereignty. What this means is that he advocated for an independent, sovereign Quebec. Why are we at Tim Hortons? I don't want a coffee. Oh wait, I know. Did you guys know that Tim Hortons was named after a real life hockey player named Tim Horton? Did you notice that I said his name was Tim Horton and not Tim Hortons with an S? Do you notice an apostrophe? Nope. The restaurant used to be called Tim Horton Donuts, then eventually Tim Hortons with the apostrophe, and now Tim Hortons without the apostrophe. Now that you know this little piece of trivia, let's talk about why the apostrophe was taken away. It's relevant. The reason for it connects directly with Bill 101. In 1976, René Lévesque won the Quebec general election and became premier. I was there. It was interesting. Historical. Bill 101 made French the language of all aspects of Quebec life. Signage had to be primarily in French. Employees were required to speak French. All immigrants and migrants to Quebec were now required to receive their public education in French. And as you can imagine, this led to a mass exodus of English businesses to other provinces like Ontario. It was one of the first steps towards sovereignty. What does Tim Hortons have to do with Bill 101? Well, Tim Hortons had to rebrand its name in order to comply with Bill 101 in Quebec. Oh, I know where we are. 1978, the white paper on sovereignty. I must have said the magic word sovereignty. In this document, Lévesque outlined his plan for the future of Quebec, Sovereignty Association. Lévesque's plan was, in a nutshell, for Quebec to separate from Canada, so sovereignty, but at the same time maintain its economic ties, so association. Sovereignty, association. The white paper on sovereignty set up an eventual referendum vote that was to take place in May 1980. Let's have a look.
I don't see why we should need any kind of second referendum in any foreseeable future for a reason I gave before. If the answer is positive, and we do get that mandate, I have enough confidence in the basic staunchness, and I think open-mindedness also, facing facts, of democracy both in Quebec and in the rest of Canada, not to put in doubt the fact that we will negotiate, and that has been confirmed.
The Premier would not say what would happen if English Canada refused to negotiate. He ruled out the possibility of the unilateral declaration of independence, saying he has other options, perhaps meaning that he could call an election on the issue. The Liberal leader, Claude Ryan, says it's at last clear that the Lévesque government wants such a strong mandate that it's virtually asking Quebecers for a blank check on separatism.
Quebec, and there would be practically nothing left of the federal system of government that we have known. The government are asking Quebecers to give them a mandate to take Quebec out of Confederation. They would have us believe that this is not tantamount to political independence or separation. I say they are wrong. I say their word cannot be trusted.
The New Deal the Levesque government is seeking isn't quite a partnership between equals, as the white paper says. A common monetary authority would be the most important institution of the association, yet Levesque proposes that it should in effect be run by English Canada.
We don't see any reason to become maniacs and say, well, the 1/4, very essential 1/4, but the 1/4 of economic activity which is represented by Quebec should be a sort of day-to-day veto on every operation. That would be silly.
I know what you're thinking. There's no way that Trudeau is going to go for this. But in 1979, he stepped down as the leader of the Liberal Party. Now, with Canada's #1 Federalist no longer in the top position, Levesque can strike while the iron is hot. Lucky for him, Joe Clark, Joe who, becomes the next Prime Minister. He's a progressive conservative, the first since Diefenbaker was in office. But he wins a minority government, which means his party has less than half the total number of seats. Uh-oh. Yep, and guess what happens next? Vote of non-confidence in December of 1979. This sends Canada into another election, the Liberal Party without a leader, and a referendum in Quebec on sovereignty association only a few months away. Levesque has won the political lottery with this series of events.
The official tally is now being done by the officials of the House, and they are rising to give the results to the House and give the results to the Speaker.
Yeas pour 139, 139. Nays contre 133, 133.
The government has been defeated, 139 to 133. To repeat, the Conservative minority government of Joe Clark has been defeated in this vote of one of confidence on the budget of John Crosbie, the finance minister. 139 to 133. The defeat of the government means that there probably will be an election in February. At this moment, what happens from here, you can see there is a degree of pandemonium in the House itself. What happens from here is that the Prime Minister needs to go to the Governor General.
Desperate, the Liberals, without a leader, facing down an election and potential independence in Quebec, turn to Pierre Trudeau and convince him to return as leader of the Liberal Party. Trudeau agrees and campaigns on a promise that if Canadians vote for him and the Liberal Party, he will patriate the Constitution. Patriate means to transfer the control of Canada's Constitution from Britain to Canada. Let's go to the 80s to find out more. It's now February 1980. We're months away from the referendum on sovereignty association. It's do or die time for Canada. Trudeau has to win, and he does. He wins a majority government and believes this is a signal that Canada wants him to defend the unity of Canada. Let's listen in.
It's been 273 days or 39 weeks since we were in this same auditorium. It's obviously, from your reaction, a great night. And here is the greatest liberal of them all, notre chef, our friend, the Prime Minister-elect, the Right Honourable Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Fellow Canadians, mes chers amis canadiens. Well, welcome to the 1980s. It's fitting and proper that less than 2 months into the decade, the people of this great nation should have been called upon to express their national will in a general election.
May 1980, the referendum happens. Voters are presented with their ballot, and the ballot reads, wait, I need a paper for this. What, you thought I could memorize it? The government of Quebec has made public its proposal to negotiate a new agreement with the rest of Canada based on the equality. This agreement would enable Quebec to acquire the exclusive power to make its law, levy its taxes, and establish relations abroad. In other words, sovereignty, and at the same time to maintain with Canada an economic association, including a common currency. Any change in political status resulting from these negotiations will only be implemented with popular approval through another referendum. On these terms, do you give the government of Quebec the mandate to negotiate the proposed agreement between Quebec and Canada? That was complex. The results of the 1980 referendum were 60% no and 40% yes. So it was a resounding defeat of Lévesque's Sovereignty Association. Some accredited Trudeau with swaying the undecided voters. Others argued that the language on the ballot was way too complex. Either way, it gave Trudeau a mandate to patriate the Constitution. And that's exactly what he started the process of doing. Let's go to 1982 to learn more. Wait, this isn't 1982, this is 1981. Are my time-traveling powers broken? That's the Chateau Laurier, not Parliament Hill. Wait, I know why we're in 1981. The Gang of Eight. The proposed constitution was submitted for study and included alongside it a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This document was contested, resulting in rewrites 5 different times to include additional provisions like rights for Indigenous peoples and for the disabled. There were 8 provinces that were opposed to the Charter. Only 2 provinces were in favor of it, Ontario and New Brunswick. Fast forward to November of 1981, and there was a final attempt to convince the 8 in opposition to join in. At this conference, things were not going well, and Trudeau was threatening to hold a referendum, knowing that it was likely Canadians would back him. Meanwhile, there were meetings happening between Justice Minister Jean Chrétien and the Roys, Saskatchewan's Roy Romano and Ontario's Roy McMurtry. As the story goes, the 3 went to the kitchen of the hotel, or maybe it was the kitchen of the conference center, and forged a deal. Because Saskatchewan was a part of the Gang of 8, it helped ease relations. Chrétien agreed to include Section 33, the notwithstanding clause, which would allow provinces to carry on with laws that might infringe upon certain charter rights. Now I know what you're wondering, but Tammy, what does this have to do with Quebec? Well, for starters, in the middle of the night, all of the various negotiators were roused from their beds to try and finalize the details. All negotiators but René Lévesque, who wasn't staying at the Chateau Laurier. Some say that Lévesque and his advisors didn't answer the phone. Others say that there was no point in even asking them because he'd never agreed to it anyway. Regardless, Lévesque came to breakfast the next morning to find a completed package. The Gang of 8, minus Quebec, had signed onto the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and ultimately the Constitution. Lévesque felt it was a betrayal and referred to it as the Night of the Long Knives. The patriation of the Constitution went forward, and on April 17th, 1982, Queen Elizabeth II signed the Constitutional Proclamation. Whoa, wasn't expecting that. Looks like we're in 1987 at Meech Lake. So, after securing the patriation of the Constitution, Trudeau finally retires for real this time, and progressive conservative Brian Mulroney becomes Prime Minister in 1984. In 1987, Mulroney wanted to get Quebec to consent to the Constitution. In order to do that, they needed an amendment, which is where Meech Lake comes in. The premiers came here to broker a deal. A central piece to the bargaining was Quebec, now led by our old friend, Premier Robert Bourassa, who was arguing for Quebec to be recognized as a distinct society. Unfortunately, the government did not seek out contributions from Indigenous and immigrant groups as well as women's rights advocates. The message they were given was that their issues and concerns would be dealt with in some future amendment, which in all likelihood would probably never happen. The provinces were given until June 23rd, 1990 to ratify the Meech Lake Accord. By the time the end date rolled around, there were changes in government for the provinces of New Brunswick, Manitoba, and Newfoundland. In general, the Accord had many faults, and they were difficult to ignore. At the time, the Manitoba legislature required that there be unanimous consent to allow for an emergency debate on the issue of the Accord. Elijah Harper from Red Sucker Lake First Nation, who was the first Indigenous member of the Manitoba Legislative Assembly, declined the motion. He argued that First Nations of Canada were not consulted, and in recognizing Quebec as a distinct society, the Accord would simultaneously be denying First Nations and Indigenous groups across Canada that same distinction. Let's have a look at that pivotal moment.
What was supposed to be a speedy start to the Meech Lake process here came to a sudden halt.
Respecting the Constitution Amendment.
Premier Gary Filmon asked MLAs to waive a rule requiring 2 days' notice before debate could begin.
Leave? No leave?
This was Filmon's reaction as one MLA said no, despite the fact the Premier had been warned that might happen. It was Elijah Harper, the only Native member of the Manitoba legislature, and for the protesters, a voice.
Is the will of the House to sit beyond 12:30? No, there is no leave.
I believe it's about time that you allow the Aboriginal people to be heard. It is not easy for me to make this decision, but who's going to speak for us? We have suffered. We have not benefited. Is that the price that we are looking for in order to be part of this country? We have won today in Manitoba and said no to Meech Lake.
As a result of his protest, the Meech Lake Accord failed. Quebec, as a result of the failure, came to support separatism again. To try and prevent Canadian unity from collapsing, Mulroney tried a second time to get Quebec to sign onto the Constitution with the Charlottetown Accord in 1992. This time, the Charlottetown Accord included Indigenous consultations, and through the Canada Clause, it acknowledged the distinctiveness of Aboriginal peoples, languages, and culture, in addition to identifying Quebec as a distinct society that included a French-speaking majority. Unlike the Meech Lake Accord, this was a referendum that Canadians would be able to vote on. The end result was that 46% of Canadians who voted were in favor of the Charlottetown Accord, and 54% were against it. The Charlottetown Accord had failed. Quebec voted against it, and in Ontario, the results were razor thin with a 0.2 difference. As this was all happening, in Quebec, a second referendum on separation was in the works. Let's go to 1995 to check it out. In 1995, Jean Chrétien, who was the Minister of Justice during the Kitchen Accord, was Prime Minister, and Jacques Parizeau was Quebec Premier. In Quebec, there were yes sides and no sides and rallies in support of each. The end result of the referendum was really tight. Approximately 94% of eligible Quebec voters voted, and the no side won, with a little over 1% lead. That's how close it came to Quebec separating from Canada in 1995. How does this all end? Let's go to 2000 to find out. Is this thing working? There we go. In 1999, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien introduced Bill C-20, otherwise known as the Clarity Act. This act allows for clarity to be established relative to Quebec secession. So in other words, is the question clear? A clear majority? So in theory, if there was a future referendum and the results were similar to the 1995 referendum, then the Clarity Act would potentially legally prevent Quebec separation. And that's the last of the major moments in French-English history in Canada. Since there's been no major attempts in Quebec to separate, and the relationship between the federal and provincial government is still tenuous, and Quebec still has not signed on to the Constitution. That's it for me. I hope you enjoyed our time-traveling adventure in this video, and that you learned a little bit more about Canada's French-English history.